as powerful and as amazing, let's say, as the God of Job could appear in the form as a human being and be the Holy Spirit. So my point is this, and as I say, I think this may be a strength or a weakness, but it does seem as if many of the difficult questions are just explained by mysteries, which is a Christian word. We don't know. So I don't know that that's whether that's a challenge or a suggestion or a help, but
it's a wonderful challenge.
But I'd be interested in your response to it.
Yes, I love this particular thing, and I've had to think about it a great deal because, of course, it's absolutely obvious that replacing one mystery by another is not always a helpful way forward.
Sometimes it might be.
Yeah, well, if it's a more sensible mystery. Let's unpack this because there are 3 or 4 questions, which is why I wrote them down, because let's come to that first question, which has interested me. But if you ask that question, it shows you've immediately categorized God as created. So you're talking about a created God. Now, you imagine if Richard Dawkins had written a book called The Created God's Delusion. I don't think many people would have bought it. Because I don't need him to tell me that created gods are a delusion. We usually call them idols, incidentally. But you see, this question is extremely interesting because it's an illustration of a question that already rules out the explanation that's most likely to be true. Because the Christian claim is that God wasn't created. So if God was uncreated, in the beginning was the Word, and I'm coming to your 3 in 1. Well, I said, can I ask you a question first? He said, sure. So I said, tell me, what is consciousness? And he thought for a second, and then he said, I don't know. I said, that's okay, let me try an easier one. What is energy? Well, he said, I'm a physicist, I can measure energy, I could use it. I said, you know, that's not my question, what is it? He said, I don't know. Oh, I said, that's very interesting. You don't know. Tell me, I said, do you believe in consciousness? Yes, he said. Do you believe in energy? Yes, he said. So I said, you believe in these 2 things and you don't know what they are. I said, should I write you off as an intellectual? And he said, please don't. And I said, but that's exactly what you were going to do with me 5 minutes ago. Now I said, if you don't know what energy is, and nobody does,
long claimed that the universe was created, and now we have the Big Bang theory that suggests at least that it started at a certain time. And yet, then there's always the issue, yes, but if there can't be an uncaused cause, then what created God? And I guess Christianity perhaps gives different answers to that. As I understand it, Augustine's answer was that God is outside time. And in a way, that's a good answer, but it seems to me that that's a way of saying we don't know what the explanation is because none of us has the slightest idea of what it means to be outside time. Or Christianity says that the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit are 3, but they are 1. And from those statements, many wonderful things follow. And yet, it seems to be a way of saying, we don't know what it is, because we have no idea of what it means to be 3 and to be 1, and how a God as powerful and as amazing, let's say, as the God of Job could appear in the form as a human being and be the Holy Spirit. So my point is this, and as I say, I think this may be a strength or a weakness, but it does seem as if many of the difficult questions are just explained by mysteries, which is a Christian word, that in a way are saying, we don't know. So I don't know that that's whether that's a challenge or a suggestion or a help, but
it's a wonderful challenge.
But I'd be interested in your response to it.
Yes, I love this particular thing, and I've had to think about it a great deal because, of course, it's absolutely obvious that replacing one mystery by another is not always a helpful way forward.
Sometimes it might be.
Yeah, well, if it's a more sensible mystery. Let's unpack this because there are 3 or 4 questions, which is why I wrote them down, because with my dying brains, I can't remember everything. But let's come to that first question, which has interested me because it's become a great focus recently. both in North America and Britain and in Europe. Everybody's talking about it. I thought I'd left it behind in Russia. And that's the question, who created God? And Dawkins has made it the heart of his book, The God Delusion. I was staggered when I found it there. What I mean about Russia, ladies and gentlemen, is I used to get this all the time in the Academy of Sciences when I was traveling out to Russia in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, you see. That it was almost the first question. If you believe that God created the universe, then logically you've got to ask the question, who created God? And then you have to ask, who created the God that created the God that created the God that created the God that created.
Dawkins asks the obvious question, who created God? The claim is that everything must have a cause, except God. That's not consistent reasoning. If God can exist uncaused, then the same logic can apply to the universe. Nothing is gained by inserting another layer. The response appeals to Augustine saying God is outside time, and to the Trinity, calling God three in one. But these are not explanations. They are contradictions restated as doctrine. When labeled as mysteries, they stop being answers and become placeholders for what cannot be explained. Lennox pushes further, arguing that mystery is legitimate and that asking, who created God, misunderstands Christianity. But this only avoids the problem. If causality applies to everything, it applies to God. If it does not, then the original claim collapses. The exception is made to protect the conclusion, not because the reasoning holds. History shows how this pattern works. From cosmology to evolution, theology has defended claims with mystery until evidence forced retreat. The same move is happening here. So the question remains, is mystery an insight, or is it just a way of avoiding the truth?
It doesn't even apply to him. And that's immensely important. The only way you can get anything out of it then in the negative sense is to assume that everything is in the category of the created, but that's just begging the original question. And the Greeks were interested in it, and that's why John's Gospel starts with those words. In the beginning, the Word already was, and then it says, all things came to be through him. The Greeks were interested in the question of two categories, the things that came to be, the created things, and the things that already were. And the question resolves down to this: is there a thing or a being that never came to be? And that is the Christian claim, and he's called God. But there's a little codicil to this, you see. Richard Dawkins, and I had a debate with him on this very topic in Oxford, and I said to him, Richard, you say that who created God is a legitimate question. I don't think it is, but let me assume now that it is. You believe that the universe created you. So I beg leave now to ask you, using your own question, who created your creator? I'm waiting still for the answer.
Dawkins asks the question directly, who created God? If everything has a cause, then God must as well. Saying the universe requires an explanation while God does not is not an answer. It is an escape from the rules set at the start. Lennox replies by turning to philosophy and scripture. He describes two categories of reality: things that began and things that have always existed. He places God into the second and says the question does not apply. But this is not demonstrated, only stated. Defining God as uncreated does not show that such a being exists. It closes the question before it can be examined. When pressed, Lennox shifts the question back toward Dawkins. If the universe produced us, he asks, then who produced the universe? This reversal avoids the issue. The universe is not claimed to be a conscious agent. Physical processes unfold without intent or design. To ask who created those processes is to assume a designer where none has been shown. The pattern is clear. The claim of an uncreated God is not a discovery but a safeguard. When asked for evidence, the discussion returns to definitions that protect the doctrine from scrutiny. The claim remains untouched, not because it is established, but because it is shielded. Philosophers have pointed to this weakness for centuries. To assert that everything needs a cause, except the one idea meant to explain everything, is to make an exemption, not an argument. The question remains, if something can exist without origin, why should that not be the universe itself? Ancient thinkers like the Stoics and Epicureans wrestled with this, and modern cosmology continues the search. None required a divine exemption to ask the question honestly. This is the tension at the heart of the exchange. One side insists that asking who created God is a category error. The other side points out that the claim itself creates the category to avoid the question. Nothing is resolved by declaring the deity exempt from the very logic used to argue for him. The history of theology is full of similar moves. From Aquinas' uncaused cause to Augustine's God outside of time, the idea remains the same. Grant God immunity from the principle applied to everything else. But this is not reasoning. It is insulation. It tells us more about the need to preserve belief than about the reality of the universe. And so the question remains where it began. If the demand for explanation applies to all things, then it must apply to God. If it does not, then the universe can stand without a cause as well. Dawkins begins with a question that cuts through the debate, and it is the same question that closes it. Who created God?
God is three in one. Is it a mystery? Yes, it is. And am I allowed to tell a little story?
Yeah,
A
although
very
I think
brief
we
one.
should, we
Yeah,
want
yeah,
to get to
moving
so
on.
yeah.
Okay.
But do tell the story. 'Cause
Yeah,
I'd like to hear it.
yeah. I was talking to about 1,000 scientists, and a man came up to me afterwards, a physicist, and he said, that was very interesting, all that talk about God, but he said, do you know, I detect you're a Christian. And I said, you're...
Very astute gentleman.
Yeah. Well, that's what I said. I said, you're pretty sharp. And he said, come off it, he said. Now look, as a Christian, you're obliged to believe that God is a triunity, that Jesus was God and man. And he said, now, come on, you're a mathematician at Oxford. This is absurd. Can you explain it to me? Well, I said, can I ask you a question first? He said, sure. So I said, tell me, what is consciousness? And he thought for a second, and then he said, I don't know. I said, that's okay, let me try an easier one. What is energy? Well, he said, I'm a physicist, I can measure energy, I could use it. I said, you know, that's not my question. What is it? He said, I don't know. Oh, I said, that's very interesting. You don't know. Tell me, I said, do you believe in consciousness? Yes, he said. Do you believe in energy? Yes, he said. So I said, you believe in these two things, you don't know what they are. I said, should I write you off as an intellectual? And he said, please don't. And I said, but that's exactly what you were going to do with me 5 minutes ago. Now I said, if you don't know what energy is, and nobody does, and if you don't believe that, you physicists, read Richard Feynman. If you don't know what energy is, don't be surprised if energy, light, gravity, and consciousness are a mystery. Don't be surprised if you're going to get an element of this in God. You're bound to get it. But now I pushed him a bit further, you see. And I said, why do you believe in these things if you don't know what they are? And that was a bit difficult. So being a kind chap, I tried to help him out. And I said, you believe in these things because of their explanatory power as concepts. And he said, that's exactly right. Now I said, look, of course I can't explain to you how God became human. But I said, it's the only explanation that makes sense of the evidence as I see it. Now I said, I've got a simple analogy that might help you. It's a very low-level analogy, but at least it's biblical. I'm married. I've been married for 42 and a half years to the same person. And, and my wife and I are, in a sense, one. We're two persons in one flesh, the Bible would say, but in one unit. And it seems to me that at the very least, don't misunderstand me when I say this, that this mystery is telling us something magnificent about God. God is not a monolith who, to put it crudely, was lonely, so he made a few people so that he could have somebody to talk to. God is himself a fellowship. Now, that's undimensioned and we can't grasp it, but there is a sense in which I feel it's got to be something like that.
Dawkins speaks directly. For him, the Trinity is incoherent. To claim God is three in one at the same time is not depth, but contradiction. When belief depends on calling a claim mystery, it removes it from reasoned discussion and shields it from real examination. Lennox responds with a story. He recalls a physicist who admitted he did not know what energy or consciousness are, yet trusted their reality because they have explanatory power. Lennox uses this to argue that the Trinity can be trusted on similar grounds. He extends this with a personal note, describing marriage as two persons joined in unity, presenting it as a window into divine reality. But the record of history gives a harder picture. Energy and consciousness remain open fields of inquiry, tested, debated, and refined across generations of thinkers. The Trinity, by contrast, became a fixed point of doctrine through centuries of dispute and political force. Councils such as Nicaea did not discover it. They defined it, silenced dissent, and enforced agreement with imperial backing. Entire communities were branded heretical for refusing to adopt it. What stands today is not the survival of a question, but the consolidation of power around a single answer. This distinction matters. Mystery in science invites deeper investigation. Mystery in theology often signals the end of questioning. When the central claim about God rests on decrees, analogies, and appeals to authority, the challenge cannot be avoided. Are we facing truth, or are we facing the legacy of a decision made under empire? Mystery will always remain part of human experience. The real issue is how it is handled. Do we use it to expand understanding or to protect beliefs from scrutiny and preserve traditions that cannot withstand doubt? What's your take on this? Do you believe religion is key to moral values, or can we build ethics and compassion independently? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this got you ideas, be sure to like, subscribe, and share to keep the conversation going.
The hardest question any of us face is not the question of science and God, it's the question of suffering and God. Now, that's not our topic tonight, ladies and gentlemen, but you wanted me to say something briefly about it? Do you? I come to North America frequently, and it's the question that comes up most often. We're faced with awful questions in our contemporary world. And the problem is that when you ask it, when it gets into the room, you realize, first of all, that there are two kinds of suffering. There's moral evil, the bad things people do to one another. And there's pain, cancers, tsunamis, earthquakes, and so on, that we don't immediately blame other people on. And then there are two perspectives. There's well, let me put it this way. Cancer looks very different to a professor of oncology than it does to the young woman at 25 with 3 children who's just been told she's 6 months to live. And when this question comes up, there's an intellectual side and there's a pastoral side. And you've got to be aware of both. So very, very briefly, and this is hopelessly inadequate. So what I'm going to say now is this. I have a website, johnlennox.org. But if you Google my name in New Zealand, I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake. And I had to change every lecture, every TV interview, every radio interview. Earthquake, why? And somebody has put them all together and they're still there. And if you want to hear what I say in detail, but very briefly, it's this. I understand people that become atheists because of suffering. I've been to Auschwitz many times and I've wept every time. What do you say? But the atheist route has problems. Because if you say, well, that's just how the world is, Richard Dawkins does this. The world's just what you'd expect it to be. If at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's his view. But half a minute, if there's no good and no evil, why are you talking about the problem of evil and pain? Where do you get the concept of good and evil from if you deny the existence of God? And I want to go down that route because I spent a lot of time in Russia. And for many of my Russian friends, Dostoevsky was almost a prophet when he pointed out, if God doesn't exist, everything is permissible. He didn't mean that atheists couldn't behave well. Of course they can. I believe that all men and women are made in the image of God as moral beings, and of course they can behave. What he meant was there's no rational justification for morality if there's no God. Just as I believe, and I've explained to you tonight, why I think there's no rational justification for science if there's no God. This is a parallel thing. So the atheist view has huge problems. And of course, what does it solve? The one thing it doesn't solve is the pain or the evil, still there. So what do we do? Well, let me tell you very briefly what I do. We've all asked the question, surely if there's a good God who's all-powerful, there'd be no evil. So he can't be good or he can't be perfect. You've all heard that, haven't you? And you've all spent hours like I did as a student going through the night. Surely a good God would, could, might, should, all this kind of thing. Have any of you ever come to a satisfactory conclusion after that? No. Not one. I've never met one. Do you know why? It's very simple to see why. Because when we finish the discussion, we're faced with beauty and barbed wire in our world. Or beauty and bombs. It's a mixed picture. That's our problem. And any explanations that don't face that just don't wash. They don't work. So how do we cope with beauty and bombs? That's putting it very bluntly. But you know, if we don't face these things, we can't solve the problem of if God was this and this and this and this, then surely he would. The fact is, we got beauty and bombs. I'm a pure mathematician, and one of the few things I've learned from that is, if you can't solve one question, change the question. So here's my question. Granted that it's beauty and bombs, is there any evidence anywhere in the universe that there's a God that you could trust with it? Now that's a big question, ladies and gentlemen. I believe there is. See, at the heart of Christianity is not only a resurrection, but a cross. Now come with me. You might find this difficult, but I often say to audiences, look, at least listen to what Christianity says before you reject it. Like I listen and spent my life listening to atheists and Hindus and so on and so forth, arguing their case. At least listen. The claim is that the man on the cross was God incarnate. That's a colossal claim. But come with me. If he was, it raises a very deep question. What's God doing on a cross? Well, at the very least, and I've often sat beside people who are suffering intensely, and some of you may be right now, and said at least that tells us that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has himself become part of it. That's a window, ladies and gentlemen. That's a window, but it opens. Because if that were the end of the story, there'd be nothing more to be said. But the resurrection now tells us that death is not the end. And when the early Christian apostles went out into the world and preached the resurrection, one of the main points they made was, it guarantees there's going to be a final judgment. That's a marvelous thing. Justice will be done. The women and children that screamed their way into eternity in Auschwitz, does God know about that? Of course he does. Now, this is a huge issue, and I almost hesitate to compress it like this. But ladies and gentlemen, the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ now become a huge focus for something absolutely colossal. Not only does the cross mean that God has drawn near to us in our suffering, it's much deeper than that. If Christianity is true, Christ took upon himself all those things that cause suffering. All the mess that I've made in my life that's caused other people to suffer. And sometimes I thought it was wonderful. My snide remarks, my hate, my jealousy, and all this kind of stuff. He's taken them upon himself so that he can forgive me. Science has nothing to say about love. It's nothing to say about forgiveness. But the biggest thing that I need as a human being is forgiveness. Is there forgiveness? Human guilt is one of the biggest problems in the universe. Now, as I say, this isn't our topic for tonight, but you did ask me to say something about it. And what I would leave you with this: I do not know of any window into this hard question that bypasses the cross. But what I do know is that millions of people have stood at that cross, and by trusting Christ and receiving him into their lives, they've received new life. You know, so often at these meetings in science, people say at the end, and I'm finishing with this, they say, you know, you're a scientist. Aren't you an idiot, really? Because sitting there talking about Christianity, Christianity is not testable. Who told you that? Christianity is testable, ladies and gentlemen. You know, when you watch young people who are dependent on drugs or narcotics, and then you meet them 6 months later and they're free, and you say, what happened to you? Where's the radiance come from? Well, and this is the way they will put it. Well, actually, I found out about Jesus Christ and I trusted him and I've got this new power, and I watched a TV program last Sunday, I think it was, at home. And it was about narcotic dependence and older people, and this house that looked after them, run by Christians. And somebody said, what does this house mean to you? And the man said, you see that door into the house? I walked through there and I got saved. Saved in the sense of his life saved and made meaningful. Why? Because they told him about Christ. You see, as you see, I'm pretty old. I'm probably pretty near the end of my life. But I have seen again and again and again and again and again transformation in life. And when you see 2 and 2 make 4 thousands of times, you begin to believe that 2 and 2 make 4. What's it got to do with? It's got to do with Christ. That's the evidence. If that wasn't there, I would quit. But it is there. And I've lived with Christ for over 60 years. And in my family and with my wife, we've put it to the test again and again. Now you say that's all subjective, but in the end, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. If there was no evidence of that kind, there would be absolutely no reason to believe.